Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And here we are on the final legislative day of Inauguration Week. As a Democrat, this was a week of mixed feelings for me and for my colleagues on this side of the aisle, but I am also a genetic optimist. So on Monday, I went to the inauguration, yes, concerned, but also optimistic about new possibilities. Committed, as I always have been, to finding ways to work with my Republican colleagues for the benefit of my constituents and celebrating the peaceful transfer of power. This time. Because, Mr. Speaker, as we all know, 4 years and 17 days ago today, in this chamber, a brutal, violent, criminal attempt was made to prevent the peaceful transfer of power in our democracy. Thousands of people rioted and descended on the Capitol, and they broke windows, and they attacked police officers with heavy objects, with bear spray, with their fists, with anything at hand. Several carried firearms. 140 police officers were assaulted. Let me say that again. 140 police officers were assaulted that day. All of us have memories of that day. I started the day up in that corner of the gallery, and when it became clear that we had to evacuate, because I was in the gallery with some colleagues, it took a long time. So we saw what was happening on the floor. We saw the Capitol Police with weapons drawn as an object broke the window of the main door to the House. We watched the Capitol Police move a heavy article of furniture. In this country, it was an article of furniture that prevented the rioters from getting into this chamber. We've all seen the images. This time, we had a peaceful transfer of power. Now, on Inauguration Day, I kept that optimism until the moment that the new president took the decision to pardon not those who were wrongly convicted for their actions on that day, not those who just got caught up in the frenzy, didn't know maybe that they were committing an offense by trespassing on the Capitol grounds. The new president pardoned every single person, including those involved in those assaults on 140 police officers, every single one of them. That was an uncomfortable moment for some of my colleagues, particularly on the Republican side. They were asked, and well, they hadn't read the pardons and they hadn't heard the story, and it was an uncomfortable moment. The Speaker responded by saying, yeah, we're not looking backwards, we're looking forwards. And then very shortly thereafter reconstituted a committee to investigate the people who investigated what happened here on January 6th. The Speaker of the House said, House Republicans are proud of our work so far in exposing the false narratives peddled by the politically motivated January 6th Select Committee during the 117th Congress. The false narratives. I get it. Sometimes people on my side of the aisle do things with which I do not agree. And I try to have the principle and the integrity to call them out for it. You have two choices when people on your side do things that are wrong. You can call them out, you can stand with principle, and you can be clear. That's what leaders do. Or you can obfuscate and try to change history. Try to suggest that what we all saw and experienced traumatically wasn't what we all saw and experienced. You can make stuff up, like maybe the FBI instigated it. Maybe it was really Nancy Pelosi's responsibility. Maybe it was Antifa. Oh gosh, maybe the people who assaulted 140 police officers were just like tourists. That is not the way of leadership. That is some dark, and evil way of proceeding. Why? Because it dishonors the truth on which the stability of this republic relies. And maybe just as importantly, it dishonors all of us who were there that day. and who saw with our own eyes what happened. And maybe worst of all, it dishonors the brave men and women who put their lives on the line that day to protect us. Those of us who put up the signs on our office doors saying, "Thank you, Capitol Police," only to turn around and remain silent when the attackers of the Capitol Police were pardoned on Monday. These are people who put their lives on the line to protect us and the democracy. I think it's worth spending a minute or two, Mr. Speaker, to remind us who these people were and what happened. Brian Sitnick, Capitol Police officer. He stood outside the gates here and fended off the attackers as they bear sprayed him in the face and eyes. The very next day, Officer Sitnick suffered 2 strokes and ultimately died, making him the first fatality of January 6th. Officer Brian Sitnick was only the 4th Capitol Police officer to die in the line of duty. Julian Cater pled guilty to pepper spraying Brian Sitnick, and he was pardoned on Monday. Officer Jeffrey Smith of the Metropolitan Police Department. He fought off rioters in the Capitol that day, only to be struck in the face by a metal pole as the siege continued that night. You can imagine the trauma. We feel it. We didn't get struck in the face by a metal pole, though. Days later, Officer Smith climbed into his Ford Mustang and shot himself in the head. Those who assaulted Officer Jeffrey Smith, now pardoned. Officer Howie Liebengood grew up in the Senate. He followed his father around. His father at the time was a Senate Sergeant at Arms. On January 6th, Officer Liebengood was posted to Senate security, where he faced down the rioters. He came back to work despite what he had seen on January 6th, on the 7th and the 8th and the 9th, unwilling to quit and inconvenience his fellow similarly depleted and exhausted officers. On the night of the 9th, Howie Liebengood took out his service revolver and shot himself. Officer Gunther Hashida, decorated Metropolitan Police Department officer. He earned the Medal of Valor, the Life-Saving Medal, and a variety of other medals throughout his 18-year career. He served on the department's emergency response team and responded here on January 6th. Officer Hashida took his own life at home in July of 2021. Officer Kyle DeFreytag, 26 years old. He'd been on the job for 5 years when he deployed to the riot, to the insurrection. He was tasked with enforcing the curfew put in place that evening. 26 years old when he committed suicide. The trauma suffered by these officers was not an accident. It wasn't an act of God or an act of nature. It was done to them by people, each and every one of whom has now been pardoned. And not just pardoned, but they're out there now celebrating and thinking about what's next. So, I guess I have 3 questions for my colleagues before I invite them to reflect on what this week has meant to them. The first question I have is, we put up the signs on the doors, "Thank you, brave police officers." Do we honor the heroic work of those who protected us? Or do we denigrate it by suggesting that it just wasn't that big a deal? Is this just about signs on office doors? Or do we raise our voices and say those who attacked the people who protected us don't deserve a pardon and certainly don't deserve celebration? Question number 2. Are we, and when I say we, each and every one of us and each and every American, are we committed without reservation or condition to the idea that our differences are worked out in here with words and debate, not out there with bear spray and clubs? Are we committed to that idea? Or do we celebrate and pardon and elevate those who wield bear spray and clubs? I hear all too often something that is pernicious in moral thinking and corrosive of our political dialogue. The whataboutism. Yeah, that was bad on January 6th, but what about Black Lives Matter throwing bricks through Starbucks windows in Seattle? What about the Biden pardons? Let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, I'm not a fan of the Biden pardons either. And I'm not afraid to say so. That thing about principle. But the whataboutism that equates a violent attempt to change the peaceful transfer of power with some idiot who throws a brick through a Starbucks window in Seattle or Portland, that is a lack of discernment. And more to the point, what a moral failure. We don't let 3-year-olds defend themselves with the idea that somebody else did it too. How has this become an exculpatory thing in our politics? Third and last, Mr. Speaker, and this is something that I think each and every one of us should reflect on. Where is your line? At what point do you say no? At what point do you find the courage to say, no, Mr. President, that's not right? This week we learned that for most of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, the pardon of the attackers of these police officers was not outside that line. At what point do you say no? At what point do you remember that the Congress is here to be a check and a balance on the president, regardless of the president's party? Mr. Speaker, if you can't answer that question, if you don't have that point, and if you don't have the commitment to principle and the courage to stand by that point, well, Mr. Speaker, I fear for the future of our republic.